At the company board meeting, my husband's father, the CEO, glared at me and said, "You're fired. Poor performance." That night, my husband slid a list of women's shelters across the table and said coldly, "You're on your own now." I left without a word. Days later, he and his father flooded my phone, 78 missed calls, after learning who I really was. I thought getting fired was the worst part of my day, until I found a list of women's shelters on my kitchen counter, highlighted and circled by my own husband. It wasn't just a betrayal, it was a carefully orchestrated demolition. They thought they'd stripped me of everything, left me with nothing. But what they didn't know is that I'd been quietly building my own escape route. But let's back up, because to truly grasp the gut punch of that moment, you need to understand how meticulously I'd constructed the life they were so casually tearing apart. It all started 3 years before, at a cybersecurity conference in Boston. I was an independent consultant, riding high, feeling like my future was entirely in my control. That's where I met Jack Caldwell. He wasn't like the others in those stuffy rooms, scrolling their phones during presentations. He actually listened. He asked smart, technical questions that proved he wasn't just there for the networking lunch. He was engaged, leaning forward, genuinely interested in my work on predictive threat architecture. After my presentation, while other consultants awkwardly pitched me their cards, Jack waited. His smile felt genuine, not rehearsed. We talked for 2 hours straight in the hotel lobby. He represented his family's firm, Caldwell Technologies, but he spoke about it with a refreshing distance. He asked insightful questions, shared valuable industry knowledge, and listened intently to my theories. When he asked for my contact information, it felt professional. 3 days later, when he called to ask me to dinner, it felt like pure possibility. Our courtship unfolded with what I genuinely believed was respectful deliberation. He introduced me to his world gradually, quiet dinners, then a weekend trip to Cape Cod where we walked beaches and talked about everything but work. Then, slowly, into his social circle. He never rushed. He always checked in, making sure I was comfortable. At the time, that patience felt like respect, like he truly saw me. Looking back now, I can see how it was also an assessment. Each step, a test to see if I'd fit into the carefully predefined space he had for me. 6 months after we met, Jack took me back to that same Boston hotel. This time, he proposed over coffee, not champagne. Jeans, not a suit. The ring was beautiful, understated. Everything about it felt authentic, like he understood that I valued substance over spectacle. I said yes before he'd even finished asking, convinced I'd found someone who saw me as an equal, not an acquisition. My mother's reaction, though, arrived like a distant storm warning that I chose to ignore. When I called to tell her the news, there was a long, heavy pause. "That's wonderful, honey," she'd said, her voice careful. "Just remember that families like the Caldwells operate differently than people like us. You'll always be an outsider." I dismissed her concern as generational cynicism, the worldview of someone who'd struggled her whole life. Jack had assured me repeatedly that his father, Henry, valued expertise and results, that he'd built his empire by recognizing talent, no matter the background. I believed him. The alternative meant acknowledging I was walking into something far more complicated than love. Our wedding 8 months later felt like it reflected my preferences. Elegant, intimate, focused on commitment. Only much later did I realize how many of those choices had been subtly steered by Jack's suggestions, his family's expectations dressed up as my own taste. I kept my maiden name professionally, a decision Jack publicly supported. But his mother, Patricia? She had a way of cutting you with a smile, making small, pointed comments about tradition and family unity. I saw Jack's public support as proof of his progressive values, evidence he was different. Now, I see it as another performance, granting me the illusion of independence while the parameters of my new life were being drawn around me with invisible ink. 2 months into our marriage, Henry Caldwell summoned me to his office at Caldwell Technologies. The building itself was designed to intimidate, all glass and steel, a lobby soaring 3 stories high. Henry's office, a prime corner with panoramic city views, was furnished with a desk so massive it could land a small aircraft. He gestured to a lower chair, a power dynamic so obvious it was almost a parody. "Violet," he began, using my first name with the casual familiarity of someone who considered such intimacy his privilege. "Jack tells me you're one of the brightest minds in cybersecurity. We could use someone with your skills." He delivered it like an extraordinary opportunity, rather than a thinly veiled family obligation to employ his new daughter-in-law somewhere visible but contained. The position? Mid-level systems analyst, maintaining existing infrastructure. The salary? 30% less than I'd earned as a consultant. Henry mentioned it with the clear expectation that I'd understand. Family came with certain financial sacrifices. The work sounded unchallenging, but he framed it as a foundation to prove myself. Jack had encouraged me to accept, painting it as an investment in our marriage. Stable schedules, no more travel, a chance to build a life together. His logic made surface sense. I told myself the pay cut was temporary, that I'd quickly advance on merit. I was so wrong. The reality of the work revealed itself within the first week. Henry assigned me to maintenance tasks an intern could handle. When I drafted proposals for infrastructure improvements that would have saved the company millions and drastically improved security, they were met with polite nods, then disappeared into the abyss of filing systems. My suggestions in team meetings were acknowledged with the kind of patronizing patience people reserve for children who don't yet understand how the adult world operates. I was there to fulfill a role, not to contribute meaningfully. I was a diversity hire, a credential they could point to. Look at us. The CEO's daughter-in-law is a systems analyst. So modern, so merit-based. The irony of being simultaneously overeducated for my tasks and completely dismissed for my actual expertise wasn't lost on me. But I told myself it was temporary. I'd prove myself. I was naive enough to believe performance would eventually matter more than politics. 6 months of that professional suffocation drove me to start building something in secret. Late nights, after the office emptied, I poured myself into my personal laptop. I was designing a new security framework, storing everything on encrypted servers completely disconnected from Caldwell's systems. I called it the Sentinel Protocol, an architecture built on predictive threat analysis, patented under my maiden name through a shell company I registered in Delaware, Monroe Security Solutions. Jack never asked why I stayed late. Henry never questioned what I was working on. They both operated under the comfortable assumption that I was just trying to earn acceptance. What they fundamentally failed to understand was that I'd stopped seeking their acceptance entirely. I was building my escape route. I was creating something that belonged exclusively to me. This wasn't about stealing intellectual property. It was about creating insurance against a future I couldn't yet articulate, but somehow sensed approaching. Around our first anniversary, the marriage itself began its quiet disintegration. Jack started checking his phone obsessively during dinners, stepping into the bedroom to take calls from his father that apparently couldn't wait. When I asked about his day, his answers became vague, distracted. He stopped asking about my work entirely. Our conversations contracted to pure logistics. I tried everything to revive what we had, elaborate date nights, weekend getaways. All canceled. All dismissed with a vague, Henry needs me. I initiated conversations about our future, the life we'd talked about building. His eyes would glaze over like he was mentally composing his grocery list. Family dinners at the Caldwell estate became a special kind of torture. Patricia, Jack's mother, had perfected the art of the subtle insult, comments about my wardrobe, questions about my ambition that implied it was unseemly for a Caldwell wife, pointed inquiries about grandchildren. And Jack? He sat through it all in practiced silence, methodically cutting his food with surgical precision. Never once defending me. Never redirecting his mother. His silence felt like complicity. Like agreement expressed through strategic absence. Late at night, lying next to a man who felt increasingly like a stranger, I'd stare at the ceiling, trying to identify the exact moment it all shifted. But there was no single moment. It was erosion. Gradual. Relentless. The slow, patient work of water wearing down stone until the foundation developed cracks too deep to repair. The life I'd built with Jack Caldwell, I was beginning to understand, had been constructed on borrowed ground. I just didn't realize how soon the lease would expire, or how brutal the eviction would be. The elevator ride to the executive floor that Tuesday morning felt different, though I couldn't have articulated why. I'd received an email the previous afternoon, performance evaluation, quarterly review. Your presence required. Conference room B, 8:30 a.m. The phrasing struck me as odd. Quarterly reviews were always team presentations, not individual evaluations. But I pushed the unease aside. I prepared thoroughly, compiling 3 years of data, documenting every success, every breach prevented, every dollar saved. I arrived at 8:15, tablet loaded with charts and graphs that told an undeniable story of excellence. My division had prevented 3 major security breaches. We'd exceeded targets by 42%. Client satisfaction scores had risen steadily. I felt confident. Proud, even. I had every reason to expect recognition, perhaps even advancement. The conference room felt arctic when I entered. Henry sat at the head of the table, in his usual position of authority. But the people flanking him made my stomach drop before my conscious mind fully registered why. Marcus from operations, a man I'd interacted with maybe twice in 3 years. And a woman I didn't recognize at all, holding a legal pad with the careful posture of someone whose job involved documenting things precisely. No one from my team. Not a single person who could corroborate my work, speak to the actual metrics. I should have turned around and walked out. The setup was obvious in retrospect, isolated, outnumbered, facing people with no direct knowledge of my contributions. But I was still operating under the assumption that facts mattered. Henry didn't smile. He didn't offer coffee or make small talk. He simply shuffled a stack of papers with theatrical precision, each movement deliberate, designed to make me wait and wonder and feel the weight of my own uncertainty. When he finally looked up, his voice carried the smooth, practiced authority of someone who delivered difficult news many times before. "Violet," he began, using my first name with a clinical, distant familiarity. "We've been reviewing your division's performance metrics. Unfortunately, the results aren't meeting our expectations." The words registered individually before assembling into meaning. Performance metrics not meeting expectations? I actually thought for a moment he was talking about someone else. Then I saw his expression. Not apologetic. Not uncomfortable. But satisfied. A cold dread settled in my chest. This was exactly the meeting I was meant to attend. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "But last quarter's numbers exceeded every projection by a significant margin. We beat targets by 42%. The security upgrades I implemented saved the company an estimated $4 million. I reached for my tablet, ready to present the undeniable truth. Henry didn't even glance at the screen. He just smiled. That smile made something cold settle in my chest because I'd seen it before. The smile of someone who'd already won, who held all the meaningful cards. Who knew that facts and evidence were irrelevant compared to the power to simply decide the outcome. "This isn't personal, Violet. It's business." He delivered the line with casual confidence, a phrase designed to absolve him of responsibility. The absurdity of it was almost impressive. How could firing someone based on fabricated performance issues not be personal? But I saw the truth in his eyes, the calculation, the predetermined outcome. He slid an envelope across the table. My full name was typed on the front, Miss Violet Monroe. Not Caldwell. The use of my maiden name felt intentional. A subtle assertion that I'd never truly belonged. "Your termination is effective immediately," Henry continued, as if reading from a script. "Security will escort you to your desk. Your access credentials will be deactivated as of 9 o'clock this morning." The lawyer made a careful note. Marcus wouldn't meet my eyes. I sat there, holding that envelope, understanding. This had never been about my performance. This was about power and control. About Henry's need to eliminate anyone who threatened his narrative of singular genius. I'd become too competent, too visible, too successful in ways that reflected well on me, rather than on him. My success was a threat. "I remember the way out," I said quietly, looking directly at Henry, holding eye contact until he was the one who looked away first. "It's the same path I used when I built half the systems currently keeping this company operational. The systems that prevented those 3 breaches, the infrastructure that's generating the revenue that pays for this conference room, and your imported coffee, and whatever satisfaction you're getting from this moment." His expression flickered, just for a second. Something that might have been uncertainty. But it passed quickly. I collected my personal items under the watch of Mitchell, a security guard I'd personally trained 6 months earlier. He wouldn't look at me either, standing 3 feet away, bearing witness to my humiliation with the uncomfortable posture of someone who knew this was wrong, but had no power to change it. I packed my chipped coffee mug, a framed photo of my mother, a small succulent. Objects that made my workspace feel personal, now reduced to pathetic evidence of my temporary status. My security badge felt heavier than it should have when I dropped it in the return tray. Angela, the receptionist I chatted with every morning, couldn't meet my eyes. Neither could the junior developers I'd mentored. Or Peterson from IT, who watched from the hallway. They all knew what I knew. Poor results was corporate code for "we're removing you before you become too powerful." The drive home felt surreal, disconnected. My mind cycled through disbelief, anger, humiliation. Why no? What had changed? The numbers were undeniable. Unless that was precisely the problem. Maybe I'd become too successful. I thought about calling my mother, but I could already hear her voice. Families like the Caldwells don't really accept outsiders. I thought about calling my best friend, Sarah. But what would I even say? I was fired for being too good at my job? It sounded insane. As I pulled into our downtown loft apartment, a new fear crystallized. I would have to tell Jack. Would he defend me? Demand answers from Henry? Or would he? The thought trailed off. But some part of me already knew the answer. Some part of me had known for months, had registered all the small signs and warnings I'd been deliberately ignoring. The key turned in the lock. I pushed open the door, expecting emptiness. Silence. Maybe a few hours to process. Instead, I found Jack sitting at our kitchen island, like he'd been deliberately positioned, waiting. The staging was obvious. His posture, too casual, too prepared. A glass of scotch sat in front of him, barely past 10:30 a.m. His laptop was open, angled just enough that I could see real estate listings, single-occupancy apartments, filtered for one-bedroom spaces. For a man living alone. He was wearing the Henley shirt I'd bought him for his birthday. He looked utterly calm while my world was still burning. "You're home early," he said. No surprise. No concern. Just flat acknowledgement. The same voice he might use if I'd returned from the grocery store. I set the cardboard box, that pathetic container of my 3 years of professional life, on the counter between us. Your father fired me, I said, watching his face for any genuine reaction. Cited poor results. Funny thing, my results were the best in company history. 42% above target, 3 major breaches prevented, for $1 million saved. But apparently that doesn't meet expectations. Jack took a slow, deliberate sip of his scotch. And I watched something shift in his expression. Not guilt. Not shock. Just a kind of resigned finality. The look of someone who'd been waiting for this exact conversation, relieved to finally have it so he could move on. He reached into a leather portfolio, expensive leather, his initials embossed in gold, and slid a folded piece of paper across the marble surface. The gesture was careful, deliberate, practiced. This wasn't spontaneous. He'd prepared this. I picked up the paper, my hands starting to shake slightly as the adrenaline from the confrontation with Henry finally caught up. What I found inside made my breath catch in a way the firing itself hadn't managed. A printed list of women's shelters in the city. 6 of them with addresses and phone numbers. Each one highlighted in yellow. One circled in blue pen with a handwritten annotation in Jack's distinctive script, closest to the metro line. He'd taken the time to research transit access. He'd evaluated which shelter would be most convenient for a woman without a car, without resources, without anywhere else to go. The cruelty of it was almost artful in its precision. Not just abandonment, but abandonment with a transit map. Now that you're unemployed, Jack said, his voice completely stripped of emotion, this arrangement doesn't work for me anymore. I need someone who can contribute. Someone who's ascending, not falling. The words landed like individual physical blows. This man I'd shared a bed with, built what I'd believed was a life partnership with, was talking about our marriage like a business venture that had failed to generate returns. I was being evaluated on the same metrics as a quarterly earnings report, and I'd been found insufficient. You knew, I said. It wasn't a question. The answer was written in every detail of this moment. From the scotch he'd poured in preparation, to the shelter list he'd researched. His slight nod confirmed it. Dad told me last week that he was planning to restructure your division. I figured we should both prepare for new chapters. It seemed like the practical thing to do. Restructure. The euphemism was almost beautiful in its cowardice. The way it transformed a deliberate termination into something that sounded like natural organizational evolution. I looked down at the shelter list again, then around at the apartment we'd furnished together. The abstract paintings I'd chosen. The bookshelf where my technical manuals shared space with his business biographies. The kitchen where we'd hosted dinner parties, pretending we were building something real and lasting. You think I need this list? I asked quietly, holding up the paper that had suddenly become the most insulting object I'd ever been handed. He shrugged. I'm just being practical. You don't have family money to fall back on. You'll need resources. I thought it would be helpful to have options researched ahead of time. The assumption underlying his words was staggering. That I was helpless without him and his family. That I had nothing of my own. That firing me and discarding me would leave me desperate and broken. I stood there, holding that shelter list, and suddenly the full architecture of their betrayal assembled itself in my mind with devastating clarity. This wasn't impulse. This was coordination, careful planning, a strategy executed between father and son with the same precision they'd applied to any business deal. Henry had told Jack a week ago. 7 full days. Which meant Jack had spent an entire week knowing that his father intended to fire me, knowing that he himself intended to end our marriage. And he'd said nothing. He'd continued the performance of normal life. Kissing me goodbye. Asking casual questions about my day. All while holding the secret like ammunition. How many nights had he lain in bed next to me, planning this exit? How many conversations had father and son had about the problem of Violet, the wife who'd become inconvenient, the employee who'd become too competent, too visible, too much of a threat? I thought back to our first anniversary, to the gradual cooling of Jack's affection. It hadn't been normal marriage growing pains. It had been preparation. Strategic emotional divestment. He'd been withdrawing his investment, protecting himself from the fallout he knew was coming. And I'd blamed myself. For months, I'd internalized the distance as my own failure, not trying hard enough, not being attentive enough. I'd auditioned desperately for a role that had already been recast, performing for judges who'd already rendered their verdict. The shame of that realization burned hotter than the anger. I'd been so carefully managed, so thoroughly manipulated, and I'd participated in my own deception by wanting so badly to believe this marriage was real. I'll be gone by morning, I said, my voice steadier than I felt, pulled from some reserve of dignity I hadn't known I still possessed. Jack actually looked relieved, his shoulders dropping slightly. He'd probably anticipated arguments, tears, desperate negotiations. My calm acceptance clearly registered as the best possible outcome. A clean break. He didn't see what was happening inside me in that moment. Not rage, though that would come later. Not grief, though that was there. buried under layers of more immediate reactions. What crystallized in my chest as I stood there, holding that insulting shelter list, was something colder and more precise than either of those emotions. It was clarity, sharp-edged and absolute, cutting through every illusion and self-deception. I packed methodically that evening. Not everything, just what was actually mine, rather than props in the life I'd been performing. My laptop, which contained 3 years of work and documentation. My backup drives, labeled innocuously as personal photos. The external hard drive I'd kept hidden, containing every patent filing, every line of proprietary code, every piece of documentation related to Monroe Security Solutions. I left behind the jewelry Jack had given me, the designer clothes his mother had encouraged me to buy. All the trappings of the life I'd been auditioning for, trying to fit myself into. What Jack didn't know, what Henry didn't know, was that I wasn't Violet Monroe, struggling, unemployed tech worker facing homelessness. I was Violet Monroe, founder and primary patent holder of the security architecture that powered every significant system at Caldwell Technologies. They thought they'd fired an employee, discarded an inconvenient wife, eliminated a problem. What they'd actually done was terminate their license agreement with the architect who'd built the very foundation their entire company stood on. And that license, with its carefully constructed renewal clauses and good faith provisions, was about to expire. I left the apartment before dawn the next morning, carrying 2 suitcases and the cardboard box from my office, leaving behind a marriage and a life that had never truly belonged to me. The city was still dark. I drove to the Riverside Hotel, a mid-range establishment, and paid cash for a week, requesting a room on an upper floor with good Wi-Fi. Room 847 became my operations center. The space was generic, bland, smelling faintly of industrial cleaner. I spread my laptop and backup drives across the desk. I pulled up the licensing agreement I drafted 2 years earlier, the one Caldwell Technologies had first acquired what they believed was my security framework. I began reviewing every clause with the focused intensity of someone whose entire future depended on the accuracy of legal language written in a very different emotional state. The Sentinel protocol that powered every significant security system at Caldwell Technologies wasn't theirs. It had never been theirs. They'd licensed it from Monroe Security Solutions, the shell company I'd registered specifically to protect my intellectual property. The license agreement itself was 37 pages of dense technical and legal language that Henry and his attorneys had apparently skimmed rather than studied. They'd been catastrophically wrong about that assumption. Buried in Section 12, subsection D, was a clause I'd written with particular care, knowing even then that I needed protection from the Caldwell family. It gave me unilateral termination rights in the event of a material breach of good faith dealing with the intellectual property creator. Section 19 defined that creator explicitly and exclusively as any individual or entity holding primary patents on the licensed technology, meaning me and only me. The license renewal date was 72 hours away. Without my explicit approval, their entire security infrastructure would begin experiencing cascading failures. I sat in that hotel room, reviewing documents until my eyes burned. Then I began drafting the formal notice that would trigger everything that came next. At 2:15 a.m., unable to sleep, I finalized the language. The notice was brief, professionally phrased, almost polite. Pursuant to Section 12D, Monroe Security Solutions hereby provides notice of material breach regarding treatment of intellectual property creator. Automatic license renewal is suspended. This suspension becomes effective at 0600 hours, September 24th. I attached a PDF copy of the original agreement, with specific provisions highlighted in yellow marker, the same color Jack had used on my shelter list. The visual parallel felt appropriate. I scheduled the email to send automatically at 6 a.m. to Caldwell Technologies' legal department, copying Henry and Peterson, the head of IT. Then I did something that carried enormous technical weight. I accessed the back-end administration panel of the Sentinel protocol using credentials Henry had never thought to revoke. With a series of keystrokes that took less than 30 seconds, I suspended the automatic license renewal. Their systems wouldn't crash immediately or catastrophically. Instead, they would begin experiencing what would appear to be random authentication failures. Like a building where the foundation was slowly crumbling, unnoticed at first, but becoming impossible to ignore. I closed my laptop. And I waited. The first call came at 6:04 a.m. Exactly 47 minutes after the systems would have started experiencing their initial failures. Henry's office line, marked as urgent. I watched it ring through to voicemail while sipping the bitter, weak coffee I'd made in the room. 3 minutes later, another call. Then another. Then Jack's personal cell, which I'd already blocked. Henry's personal cell? Declined. Peterson from IT? Declined. Someone from their legal department? Declined. By noon, my phone displayed 78 missed calls and a cascading flood of text messages that grew increasingly desperate in tone. Early ones were professionally phrased. Violet, we need to discuss some technical issues. Then the facade started cracking. This is urgent. Please respond immediately. Then the pretense of professional courtesy disappeared. Whatever this is about, we can work it out. Just call me back. And finally, from Henry himself, just after 11:30, name your price. Name my price. As if this were simply a negotiation about money. As if everything in the world came down to finding the correct number on a check. The assumptions embedded in those 3 words told me everything I needed to know about how fundamentally Henry had misunderstood what was happening. I let them sweat for 3 days. Not out of cruelty, though I won't pretend there wasn't some satisfaction in knowing they were panicking while I sat calmly in a hotel room, drinking bad coffee. The silence was strategic. I needed them to fully understand the extent of their dependency. I needed them to bring in outside consultants who would scratch their heads at code that was simultaneously brilliant and completely impenetrable without documentation only I possessed. I needed Henry to sit in emergency board meetings, trying to explain to increasingly angry board members why the company's competitive advantage was evaporating. I needed Jack to realize his father had made a catastrophic miscalculation. And I needed time to feel out the other calls that were starting to come in, the good ones, from companies who'd heard through industry back channels that something interesting was happening at Caldwell Technologies. On the second night, sitting alone with takeout food going cold, I finally called my mother. She answered on the first ring, relief flooding her voice. Violet, baby, where are you? Jack's been calling me, saying you left. Mom, listen, I interrupted, my voice steadier than I felt. Something in my tone made her go immediately quiet. That maternal instinct that recognizes when a child needs to speak without interruption. I told her everything. The firing, the fabricated performance issues, the shelter list Jack had prepared with transit annotations, the coordinated betrayal between father and son, the license agreement they'd never properly read, the systems that were currently failing in ways they couldn't fix without me. When I finished, there was a long silence, heavy with processing. Then she said something I hadn't expected, something that broke through the careful control I'd been maintaining for 2 days. I have $48,000 in savings. It's yours if you need it. My mother, who'd raised me alone after my father died when I was 8, who'd worked double shifts as a nurse for 15 years to keep us housed and fed and put me through college without debt. She was offering me her entire financial security. Mom, I started, but she interrupted me with the firmness that had gotten us both through the hardest years of my childhood. I know you don't need it. You never did. But I need you to know you have it. You're not alone, baby. You never were. I broke then. Not from sadness, but from something fiercer and more complicated. Gratitude, rage, determination, all mixing into an emotional response I couldn't quite name. Tears came that I hadn't allowed myself since Jack had slid that shelter list across the counter. I'm going to make them understand what they did, I told her, my voice thick. I know you are, she said, with absolute certainty. And I'll be here when you do. That conversation changed something fundamental. This wasn't just about me anymore. The calls from Caldwell Technologies continued. By the end of day 3, the count exceeded 100. I didn't answer any of them. I was done responding to their schedule. On the 4th morning, I woke at 5:30 without an alarm. The anxiety and second-guessing of the past 72 hours had crystallized overnight into absolute clarity. I made coffee, opened my laptop, and began drafting the email that would fundamentally alter the power dynamic. The message needed to be perfect, not emotional, not accusatory, just factual. I addressed it to Henry's private email address, the personal account he used for matters he preferred not to have documented. No greeting. No preamble. Just a single sentence. Please find attached documentation regarding the ownership and licensing structure of the security systems currently powering Caldwell Technologies operations. The first attachment was the complete license agreement for the Sentinel protocol, all 37 pages, with specific provisions highlighted in yellow. Section 12D, outlining material breach conditions and termination rights. Section 19, providing an explicit definition of the intellectual property creator as the individual or entity holding primary patents on the licensed technology. Section 23, detailing my unilateral authority to terminate or suspend the license under specified circumstances, which included, and I'd been very careful about this language, treatment of the creator that could reasonably be interpreted as acting in bad faith or failing to acknowledge their contributions appropriately. The second attachment contained every patent filing I'd submitted over the past 3 years for components of the Sentinel protocol. Each one registered to Monroe Security Solutions, months before Caldwell Technologies had supposedly acquired the system. Each filing listed me as the sole inventor, my maiden name appearing on every official document where ownership and creative credit were formally established and legally protected. Henry had apparently never investigated any of this. Why would he? I was just his son's wife, a diversity checkbox. At the bottom of the email, below the two attachments, I added a single line: "You fired the architect. The building is noticing." I hit send at exactly 6 a.m. The same time their systems had begun experiencing cascading failures 4 days earlier. The symmetry felt important. My phone rang at 7:14. Henry's private cell number. I let it ring 4 times before answering. A small, petty gesture. Violet, his voice carried none of the smooth authority I'd heard 4 days ago. He sounded diminished. "We need to meet face to face. There are things too complicated for phone conversations." "No," I said, keeping my voice calm and level. "You need to listen. 3 years ago, you hired me as what you clearly viewed as a favor to your son. You treated me like a diversity checkbox. You assigned me maintenance work that was beneath my capabilities. You never bothered to learn what I was actually building during all those late nights you probably assumed I was spending trying to prove myself worthy of your family's acceptance." Silence on the other end. "When you needed to upgrade your security systems 2 years ago, I provided the solution through a licensing agreement your lawyers apparently didn't read with appropriate care. You thought you were acquiring technology outright. You were renting it. From me." "That's not," Henry started, but I cut him off. "The license renewal came due 3 days ago. I declined to approve it. Every system currently keeping your company operational is now running on borrowed time. Your client portals are experiencing authentication failures. Your internal communications are flagging false security threats. Your competitive advantage is evaporating in real time. And all of it traces directly back to the woman you fired for supposedly poor results that were actually the best performance metrics in company history." Another silence. Longer this time. Heavy with the sound of a man processing information that was rewriting his understanding of his own situation. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. Smaller. Uncertain. "What do you want, Violet?" The question revealed how completely he'd still misunderstood. He still thought this was a negotiation. "Justice," I said. "But I'll settle for watching you explain to your board of directors why your company's entire infrastructure is held together with licensing agreements controlled by the woman you just fired for fabricated performance issues." Henry tried to recover, shifting into negotiation mode. "We can offer you reinstatement immediately. Better title. Vice President level. Equity stake. Whatever it takes to make this right." "I don't want to work for you, Henry," I said, with a clarity that surprised me. "What you destroyed wasn't just a job. It was a partnership you never deserved and never appreciated until it was too late to matter." I could hear him breathing, each exhale carrying the weight of a man realizing he'd miscalculated catastrophically. "The licensing agreement can be terminated with 30 days notice," I continued, letting the implications settle. "Or it can be renegotiated under new terms that would require certain acknowledgments. That renegotiation would need to include formal documentation of material breach, which means board minutes recording that you fired your chief security architect based on fabricated performance issues, while she was actually delivering the best results in company history. It means explaining to your investors why you didn't know that the foundation of your company belonged to someone else. It means acknowledging publicly what you did and why it was wrong." "You're trying to destroy the company," Henry said, anger creeping back into his voice. "No," I corrected. Firmly. "I'm teaching you the cost of underestimation. The company can survive this. The real question is whether you can survive it." I ended the call before he could respond. Not out of drama, but because the conversation had served its purpose. The industry moved faster than I'd anticipated. Within hours of Caldwell Technologies' system failures becoming visible to clients and competitors, my inbox had begun filling with messages. Sarah called that afternoon. "You're a legend in tech circles right now," she said, her voice carrying equal parts awe and amusement. "People are calling it the quietest power move of the decade. Caldwell's stock is tanking, and nobody could figure out why until someone traced it back to a licensing dispute with Monroe Security Solutions, which nobody had heard of, which turns out to be you." 2 companies reached out with VP-level offers that same day. Another wanted to discuss acquiring Monroe Security Solutions itself, which struck me as deeply ironic given it was a shell company I'd created to protect my IP from people like Henry. I'd been invisible at Caldwell Technologies for 3 years. Now the industry was scrambling to understand how I'd built something so essential. I had 3 formal job offers, each paying more than double what Caldwell had. One came with a signing bonus that exceeded Jack's annual salary. I accepted the most prestigious offer before midnight, feeling something shift in my chest. This wasn't just about leaving Caldwell behind. It was about stepping into something I'd built for myself on my own terms, with people who actually understood what I was worth. I closed my laptop, and for the first time in months, felt anticipation that wasn't tinged with dread. 6 weeks passed in a blur of onboarding meetings and team introductions at Titanium Solutions. It operated differently than Caldwell Technologies in ways that became apparent immediately. People actually listened when I spoke. My technical recommendations were implemented, not filed away. The CEO, Rebecca, treated expertise as valuable, not threatening. It was disorienting at first, this environment where competence was rewarded instead of resented. Then the news broke publicly. Caldwell Technologies issued a press release on a Thursday afternoon, strategically timed for aftermarket close. Sarah forwarded it to me with a single word, finally. The statement itself was a masterpiece of corporate obfuscation, following an internal review. Caldwell Technologies announces a restructuring. CEO Henry Caldwell has agreed to temporary administrative leave. To anyone paying attention, every phrase signaled catastrophe barely contained. Internal review meant something had gone badly wrong. Temporary administrative leave meant Henry had been forced out. Sarah called within minutes. "This is bigger than I thought," she said. Henry had to explain the licensing dispute. Admit that the company's core technology was controlled by his former daughter-in-law. Justify why he'd fired you when your actual performance was exceptional. 2 board members resigned. The stock dropped 18%. I sat at my desk, watching the city lights come on. Part of me felt vindicated. Part of me felt strangely empty, like I'd been preparing for a confrontation that was now happening without me present. Jack started calling again during week 7. I'd unblocked his number by then, curious. His voicemails told their own story of progressive desperation. The first carried irritation. "Violet, I don't know what you're doing, but you need to stop this. People are getting hurt. You're destroying something my father spent his life building." I deleted it without responding. The second, 3 days later, shifted to confusion. "I know you're angry, but can we just talk? Figure out some way to resolve this that doesn't involve taking down the entire company." Delete. By the third message, panic had crept into his voice. "Dad's under investigation. The board is talking about forcing him out permanently. His reputation is being destroyed." Is that what you wanted? The assumption was almost amusing, that I'd orchestrated this outcome through careful planning, rather than simply withdrawing support they'd taken for granted while treating me as disposable. On week 8, Jack appeared at my new office building downtown. Security called to inform me someone claiming to be my husband was in the lobby. I pulled up the camera feed. He was holding expensive roses, the kind you buy when desperation has replaced thoughtfulness. He looked smaller than I remembered. The confidence he'd carried during our marriage had been replaced by a palpable uncertainty. "We're separated," he'd told the guard. "Ms. Monroe, there's a Jack Caldwell here. Should I send him up?" I watched him on the monitor, standing with his wilting flowers. And I felt nothing. Not anger. Not grief. Not even satisfaction. Just a neutral observation. "No," I said. "Tell him I'm in a meeting that's running long. He should try calling if he needs to discuss something." I watched the guard deliver the message. Jack's face registered confusion, then frustration, then something that looked like resignation. He left the flowers on the reception desk and walked out, shoulders hunched against a cold that was as much emotional as meteorological. My new position at Titanium Solutions provided exactly what Caldwell Technologies had denied: autonomy, resources, and recognition. We launched Sentinel Protocol 2 at a major tech conference. The presentation was mine to deliver. My face was on the screens as I talked about adaptive security architecture. The audience included several companies I recognized as Caldwell Technologies clients. I saw their representatives taking careful notes. Within 3 weeks, 4 major clients had formally requested proposals for switching their security infrastructure from Caldwell to Titanium Solutions. The market was voting with contracts, and the verdict was unmistakable. They preferred working with the architect rather than the company that had discarded her. Sarah called after the presentation, her laughter carrying genuine delight. "You just declared war without firing a single shot. That was the most professionally devastating thing I've ever witnessed." "It's not war," I replied, meaning it. "It's just better engineering. The technology speaks for itself." But late one evening, working alongside Clara on a particularly stubborn debugging problem, she asked me something that cut through all the professional success and public vindication. "Do you feel satisfied?" she asked, looking up from her screen. Watching Caldwell Technologies implode, Henry under investigation, Jack showing up with desperate flowers. "Is it what you thought it would be?" I opened my mouth to say yes, automatically, to confirm that justice felt exactly right. But the words caught in my throat. Because the truth was significantly more complicated than simple satisfaction. I felt vindicated, certainly. Proven right about my capabilities and their judgment. But satisfied? That wasn't quite accurate. There was a hollowness at the center of all this, like winning an argument with someone who'd already left the conversation. What I'd actually wanted, I realized, wasn't revenge or destruction. I'd wanted recognition. Acknowledgement that my contributions had value. I'd wanted Henry to see me as genuinely talented, not as his son's wife hired as a favor. I'd wanted Jack to love me for who I actually was. But I would never receive that recognition from them. They lacked the self-awareness required for genuine apology. "It's not about satisfaction," I finally told Clara. "It's about building something they can't take away. Something that exists independently of whether they acknowledge it or not." She nodded slowly, like she understood more than I'd explicitly said. Perhaps she did. Perhaps that was the real commonality between people who'd left toxic workplaces, not the specific details of betrayal, but the recognition that the revenge that matters isn't destruction, but creation. That night, alone in my apartment that was slowly starting to feel like home, I drafted an email to Jack that I never sent. Words I needed to write, even knowing they'd never be read. You asked if destroying your father's company was what I wanted. I wanted partnership. I wanted respect. I wanted to build something meaningful together. You wanted a trophy wife. Your father wanted control. The difference between those desires is what destroyed everything, not anything I did afterward. I saved the draft. Then, 2 days later, I deleted it. Some conversations exist only for the person writing them, serving their purpose without ever being read by their intended recipient. Life continued moving forward. Then the letter arrived. A courier knocked on my door on a Saturday morning, holding a manila envelope. Inside was a single sheet of heavy cream stationery, Henry Caldwell's personal letterhead, embossed. But what made me pause was that the letter itself was handwritten in fountain pen. Violet, it began, I request the opportunity to speak with you in person, not as former employer to employee, but as one person to another. I have come to understand the magnitude of my errors in judgment. Whatever you believe about my motivations, please allow me one conversation. This is not a negotiation. It is a request for the chance to apologize properly. I read it 3 times, searching for the trap, the hidden manipulation. But the words just sounded tired. Like an old man who'd finally calculated the full cost of decisions he couldn't undo and found the price steeper than he'd anticipated. Sarah thought I shouldn't go. He doesn't deserve your time, she said. My mother disagreed. Sometimes people need to say they're sorry out loud, she'd said. Not for you necessarily, but so they can live with themselves afterward. I thought about it for 2 days. Finally, I texted a single line to the number at the bottom of his letter. Coffee. Public place. Tuesday at 10 o'clock. His response arrived within 30 seconds. Thank you. We met at a cafe 3 blocks from my office. Neutral territory. Henry walked in exactly at 10 o'clock. The first thing I noticed was how much smaller he seemed. Not physically, but something fundamental had diminished. The arrogance that used to fill rooms, the certainty that came from never questioning his decisions, had contracted into something more uncertain, more human. He ordered coffee he never drank. Thank you for meeting me, he began, his voice lacking its usual command. I didn't respond, just waited. He took a breath. I convinced myself I was making a business decision when I fired you. That the company needed restructuring. That consolidation was strategic. I was lying to myself. He paused. The truth is, you scared me. Not because you were incompetent, but because you were brilliant in ways I didn't fully understand and couldn't control. You were building systems I couldn't claim credit for, earning genuine loyalty from teams I'd hired but never inspired. And instead of recognizing those things as success, I saw them as a threat to my position. So, you destroyed what you couldn't control, I said quietly. Yes. He looked directly at me for the first time. And in doing so, I destroyed my company's future, my son's marriage, and whatever legacy I thought I was building. I turned something that could have been a genuine partnership into a power struggle that I've lost in every meaningful way. We talked for another 30 minutes. He didn't ask for anything. He just apologized, acknowledged what he'd done and why, and accepted that the damage was beyond simple repair. When we parted ways, I felt something shift that I couldn't quite name. Not forgiveness, exactly. But perhaps a loosening of the anger I'd been carrying like armor. 2 weeks later, Jack tried his own approach. He showed up at my apartment building on a Thursday evening, waiting in the lobby. The security guard called. I surprised myself by saying I'd come down. We sat in the building's small courtyard, November cold making our breath visible. Jack looked exhausted, older than his 32 years. I don't expect forgiveness, he started, his words rehearsed. I just need you to know that I was wrong about everything. About thinking your value was tied to your employment, about not defending you to my father, about that shelter list that I convinced myself was practical when it was just cruel. I waited, because I could feel the but coming. But I do think we could start over. Not as we were. I know that's impossible. But maybe as people who once cared about each other, without my father's influence, without the company dynamics. Just trying to build something real this time. There is no justice, Jack, I said quietly. There never was. When you handed me that shelter list, you showed me exactly who you are when loving someone becomes inconvenient or complicated. That's not something you start over from. That's foundational character revealing itself. One mistake, he began. It wasn't one mistake, I interrupted. It was 3 years of choosing your father's approval over your wife's dignity. The shelter list was just the moment when I finally saw the pattern clearly enough that I couldn't ignore it anymore. He looked down at his hands, silent for a long moment. I'm sorry, he said again, like repetition might change the mathematics of what had happened. I know, I replied. But sorry doesn't rebuild what you burned. It just acknowledges the ashes. After those conversations, I wrote 2 final emails. The first to Henry laid out clear boundaries, appreciation for his apology, but a firm establishment that a professional relationship was the extent of what existed between us now. The licensing agreement would stand as written. He would pay fair market rates. I would provide contracted support, nothing more. The second email to Jack was shorter, more direct. The answer to his question about starting over was no. Not because of hatred, but because of an absence of trust that couldn't be rebuilt from these particular ruins. I wished him well, genuinely, but from a distance that would remain permanent. I hit send on both emails, and something in my chest released. Not quite peace, but something adjacent to it. Closure, I realized, wasn't forgiveness or reconciliation. It was simply deciding that the story was finished, that no additional chapters would be written. The conversations had provided something I hadn't expected: completion. The ability to finally close a chapter that had been left hanging open, consuming energy I needed for building what came next. 6 months after leaving Caldwell Technologies, Monroe Security Solutions had transformed from a protective shell into something substantial and real. Clara and I formalized our partnership. We rented office space downtown, hired our first employees, and began the complicated work of turning theoretical principles into operational reality. The company we built looked nothing like Caldwell Technologies. We structured leadership to be genuinely collaborative. Profit sharing was built into employment contracts. We established mentorship programs specifically targeting women in technology who'd been told they were too aggressive, too ambitious, too much. In March, we landed a major government contract providing security infrastructure for federal database systems. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd gone from being fired for fabricated poor performance to being trusted with national security architecture. Our first-year revenue exceeded what Caldwell Technologies' entire security division had generated. Trade publications started requesting interviews. How did you rebuild after such public professional failure? One major tech magazine asked. I chose my words deliberately. When someone tries to erase your contributions, I said, the most powerful response isn't confrontation or destruction. It's building something so undeniably yours that they can never take credit for it. Something that exists completely independent of their acknowledgement or approval. The article ran with the headline, "The Architect Who Built Her Own Empire." And suddenly, I was receiving messages from young women across the industry, sharing stories that were depressingly familiar. My story wasn't unique. It was simply one example of a pattern so common, it had become normalized. Clara and I discussed this pattern over late-night strategy sessions, and from those conversations emerged the Monroe Fellowship Program. We created structured opportunities specifically for women who'd left toxic workplaces, providing technical training, professional development, and, perhaps most importantly, a community of people who understood what they'd experienced. My mother flew in for the opening of our expanded office space in May. I picked her up from the airport and drove her directly to the building, wanting her to see it. She walked through the space slowly, taking in the glass walls that made work visible, the collaborative areas, the small kitchen where employees gathered for lunch. Her eyes filled with tears as she turned to look at me. Your father would have been so proud of you, she whispered. We rarely talked about my father. He died when I was 8, leaving her alone with impossible financial obligations. But she'd managed, through sheer determination, working double shifts for 15 years, never remarrying, never complaining. Just moving forward with a quiet strength that I'd absorbed without fully recognizing it as the foundation of my own resilience. I didn't do this alone, Mom, I said. You taught me everything that made this possible. How to build from nothing, how to keep going when circumstances seem impossible. She shook her head firmly. No, baby. I taught you how to survive. You taught yourself how to build. How to create rather than just endure. That's different, and it's all you. That conversation healed something I hadn't known needed healing. Guilt I'd carried for years about being the reason she'd sacrificed so much. Raising you wasn't sacrifice, she said, with that same firmness. It was the best investment I ever made, and watching you now proves I was right. In June, Sarah called with news that shifted my world in unexpected ways. She was getting engaged, and she wanted me as her maid of honor. The wedding was planned for late September, exactly 1 year after Henry had fired me. The wedding took place in a small garden venue, intimate and beautiful. I stood next to my best friend as she married someone who clearly adored her. And I realized, with startling clarity, that I was genuinely happy. Not performing happiness, not experiencing the grim satisfaction of watching former enemies face consequences, but feeling real joy for someone else's beginning. During the reception, Sarah pulled me aside. Thank you for being here. I know this must be strange, being at a wedding after everything that happened with Jack. It's not strange at all, I told her. Honestly, it's actually perfect. I'm watching someone I love choose a partner who genuinely deserves her. That's not painful. It's hopeful. It reminds me that good relationships actually exist. She hugged me tightly. You're going to find that too, when you're ready for it. Maybe, I said. But right now I'm discovering something that might be better. I'm finding out who I am without needing someone else to define or validate me. Later that night, dancing with colleagues, strangers, and my mother, who'd had just enough champagne to become delightfully uninhibited, I felt something fundamental shift. The anger I'd been carrying like protective armor had finally transmuted into something lighter and more useful. Not forgiveness, exactly, but release. I didn't need Henry or Jack to acknowledge what they'd taken from me, because I'd built something they couldn't touch or diminish. The most meaningful moment came in October when a young engineer named Maya joined Monroe Security Solutions. She was 26, brilliant, and recently laid off from a company that had told her she wasn't a cultural fit, the same coded language I'd encountered. I took her to lunch on her first day, and she asked me the question I'd been anticipating. How did you actually do it? Go from being fired to building this company? Everyone talks about resilience, but what did that actually look like for you? I thought carefully about how to answer honestly. I stopped waiting for permission to be valuable. I stopped believing that my worth was determined by whether other people recognized it. And I stopped building things for people who treated my contributions like favors they were granting me, rather than essential work that deserved appropriate compensation and respect. She nodded slowly. I'm really angry, she admitted. At the people who discarded me. At the systems that allowed it to happen. At myself for not seeing the warning signs earlier. Good, I said. Anger is useful fuel when it's directed appropriately. Just don't let it become your permanent destination. Use it to build something better. Then let it go when you don't need it anymore. 6 months later, Maya led the team that landed our biggest client contract. When she presented the technical architecture at our company meeting, speaking with confidence and precision, I caught Clara's eye across the room, and we shared a smile that communicated everything without words. We built this. Not just a company, but a genuine space where people like Maya could develop their capabilities without having to perform someone else's narrow version of acceptable behavior. That evening, driving home through the city, I passed Caldwell Technologies building. I felt nothing but mild curiosity about how different the interior must look now. New leadership had restructured operations. Henry had officially retired. Jack had relocated to the West Coast for what his LinkedIn profile described as a fresh start. The empire they'd attempted to build through control and hierarchy had contracted into something smaller, but perhaps more sustainable. I didn't feel triumphant observing this. I just felt free, finally unburdened by the need for their acknowledgement or their downfall. Because I'd learned something essential through all of this. The most effective response to being erased isn't destruction of those who wronged you. It's building something so undeniably your own that they become irrelevant footnotes in a story they never understood they were losing the right to narrate. I drove home to my apartment, modest, but genuinely mine, filled with furniture I'd chosen and books I actually read. My phone showed a text from my mother, proud of you every single day. I sat in my car for a moment after parking, engine off, city lights creating patterns through the windshield. And I let myself feel the full weight and the lightness of what I'd built from the ashes of betrayal. Then I went inside and opened my laptop to review proposals for the next phase of company expansion. Because that's what architects do. We build.